Hello, friends. Patrick McFarland here of the Liberty Weekly podcast, coming at you with another episode. This one is episode 191. The show notes may be found at libertyweekly.net/191. And today I'm really glad to be joined by Hunter DeRensis. And Hunter, you're involved with so much stuff that I just thought I'd hand it over to you to tell us about all that stuff.
Thank you for having me on, Patrick. Really happy to be here. Yeah, I do wear a couple hats in my life. I am the editor at the Libertarian Institute. I am the communications director for the veterans advocacy organization, Bring Our Troops Home. Your listeners might be familiar with that as the organization most involved in the Defend the Guard movement. And I am formerly the senior reporter at the National Interest, and I write regularly for the American Conservative, among a couple other publications.
Awesome. Yeah. In the main reason I brought you on was to talk about your article that was just featured in the print edition of the American Conservative. And is that the November-December issue?
Yes.
Okay. So that one is entitled Merchants of Death. You'll see that on the thumbnail for the video here, the video version. But I also wanted to bring you on because you're my colleague at the Libertarian Institute. You haven't been on this show before. Have you done a lot of podcasts before?
Oh, on occasion. I think I've done Scott's show maybe 3 or 4 times, a couple other things.
Okay. Well, so do you just want to tell people, what's your Liberty story, since this is your first time on my podcast, and how did you come to be active in this space, and how did you start writing?
So I came into the libertarian movement, I guess the same as most libertarians, in the sense of Ron Paul had something to do with it, but I was a little late to the party. So I started out very interested in politics from a young age. We're talking like 12, 13 years old, getting into politics and being very annoying at it. Starting off as a basic, Fox News Republican. So imagine the worst kind of boomer con, but put it as like barely a teenager. Is a terrible, terrible sight to see. But got really into that, and I've loved history even longer. It's always been my favorite subject, even since I was a child, so those just naturally intertwined. And I really got started in libertarianism just after the 2012 election. So it was sort of, you could say that Mitt Romney's defeat was my real radicalizing moment when I abandoned the system. Oh, this can't be fixed. I thought Mitt Romney was going to save America, my 13-year-old mind. So, or slightly older, but so after that, actually the first Ron Paul speech I ever heard was his farewell address to Congress. So it was immediately after the campaign that I really discovered that. And it was around that same fall of 2012 that I read End the Fed, starting learning more about economics, and then eventually foreign policy, which was really became my personal passion, because previously it had been the issue where I had disagreed with libertarians the most. And I feel that's similar for a lot of libertarians, that it's always foreign policy is typically the last thing to fall, where, oh, sure, we agree with the free market. Hey, even end the Fed, I can get on board with that. Private courts? Maybe, but, oh, what? We're not going to bomb the Middle East? You're crazy. But once I really read on the issue and discovered it and developed such a moral indignation to what the government does, and especially claims to do in my name, foreign policy and the question of war and peace really became my passion project. And from there, I went to school at George Mason University, which has a very sizable libertarian community, very involved with college Republicans. And from there, I just sort of meandered on as sort of, oh, well, I know I want to dedicate my life to the issues I care about, but I really don't know how to do that or where to start. And it really changed when I finally met Scott Horton, our boss, in, what year would that have been? That would have been, I want to say, spring of 2018. I finally met him in person. Scott and I had followed each other on Twitter for a couple years. We had DM'd, we had interacted, but it was finally meeting him in person at the Israel Lobby Conference hosted in D.C., where I met him, and it might have been the first time that someone actually talked Scott's ear off, because I just, after the conference, wanted to ask him questions for hours. And afterwards, he DM'd me on Twitter, and he asked, hey, man, if you have a blog or anything you want to write for the Institute, just let me know. We'd love to publish it. And that was a real wake-up call because I had never considered writing as a career choice whatsoever. I don't know how you break into that. I had always considered myself a much stronger speaker than I was a writer. And besides, the compliments you kind of shrug off, which, Patrick, I'm sure you get, of your mom saying, "Oh, you're so good at this. You need to keep going." Ones you obviously ignore. But it was finally getting Scott Horton, a personal hero, to say, "Hey, you seem to know what you're talking about. You should write something." That I really got started. I wrote a couple pieces. I published my very first article with the Libertarian Institute. It was my first ever published piece in, I want to say, March of 2018. And then that fall, I got an internship with the American Conservative, which really introduced me to a lot of connections in D.C. And then January 2019, I started at the National Interest, which was just based on the recommendation of the American Conservative. And I've been writing and doing that work ever since. And that all started because, Scott Horton said, "Hey, you're good enough to do this. You should start." And that started my whole career path, which I've been on for a couple of years now and doing pretty satisfactory on, at least for myself.
Yeah, well, that's awesome. And so a lot of what you said actually kind of parallels my own journey with libertarianism, because I came into this in the crater of the 2012 election. And so I was part of Young Americans for Liberty at the University of Minnesota. And then we brought Ron to talk there. And so it kind of snowballed from there. Except for me, the hardest issue for me was the war on drugs. I think I think it's really special what the Institute is doing. And I wanted to mention too that we're nearing the end of our fundraiser. And so if you go to libertarianinstitute.org/donate, there's a generous donor who's been able to match any donations. So you get that matched and help get us over our goal of 60,000. But it's excellent what we are able to do because, Scott takes submissions. There's a tab at Libertarian Institute. And if you want to do something, if you want your voice heard, I think that, you can start a podcast, but if you start a podcast, another prestigious thing that you can do. And I think writing is a bit more prestigious, just in my mind. But you can write an article, you can start, and then you get your name published, and you could do other things. Maybe someone notices good work that you do. So I don't know, but I think Connor Freeman has had kind of the same thing. I know Connor's written and submitted at other places as well, but it's a great stepping stone, if anything else.
Yeah, and I'd certainly encourage any listeners, if you have an idea, if you have something where you have a certain take on something that you're not seeing expressed in other places, write it down. It can be the equivalent of just a long Facebook post. Get started, submit stuff. I'm the editor. I'm the person who looks over all original submissions, does some copy editing, make sure it gets up. Send me good stuff. I want good stuff to edit. Make my job a little easier. Give us some great content. Nothing but encouragement in that direction.
Yeah, and I'm so glad that, you and I met each other at the Ron Paul conference that he just did, the War on Us. And we didn't get too much of a chance to talk about the Institute, but it's one of the most decentralized organizations I've been a part of because, in a lot of ways we're so busy ourselves and we're just kind of doing stuff, doing our own thing. But to be able to talk to you and kind of, I wanted to get your background and see, these other projects you've worked on and all the things that you published. So, but I wanted to bring you on, like I said, because of your latest article, Merchants of Death. And you talk about a book that was published, which we'll get into, Merchants of Death, but it's it's a very powerful statement, just those words. And so I wanted to ask you, what brought you to write this piece?
This is an article that I've been formulating in my head for a couple years now. I actually had the idea way back in, it might have been late 2019. Or late 2018, excuse me. So the first year I started writing, when, you just have a thesis statement or something going through your head and you make a little note of it and you think, oh, I might develop this into something. And it was essentially how the military industrial complex has changed over the past century. How did we go from a point when there was such public outrage and public interest in the issue of private companies making profit off of the public war machine? how did we go from that to today when it's such a backwater issue? Very few people care about it, and the people who do care don't exactly frame it in the same outraged way that it was a century ago. And I really wanted to do an analysis of that because it'd be an enormous project to do a complete history of the military industrial complex itself. But I wanted to sort of just take a chunk of that and do a history of public sentiment towards the military industrial complex. And then just at the end of this summer, I decided to sit down and say, okay, I've had this idea for a couple years. Patrick, I'm sure you go through the same process of you're reading something or you're listening to something and you just hear something. You're like, oh, that's a good point. And you just make a little note, and eventually that just combines into something until you want to use it for a later project. So I finally sat myself down, decided to write it, and the American Conservative was gracious enough to publish it. And I'm very grateful to that because this is a mainstream conservative publication, well respected, I think, in conservative circles. And they allowed me to publish this article where I'll just read my opening sentence. Is it unethical to profit off the mass death of your countrymen, and should something be done about it? You're not exactly going to find that kind of sentiment in National Review or a lot of other places. So even I'm surprised by what they allow me to get away with. But I am very grateful that they gave me an outlet to really publish this idea and get these views, which I know we both agree are so important to really get out there into the public square.
Yeah, and here's the article here. I just wanted to pull it up. And so it's such an important issue. And I know that in my own libertarian journey, it wasn't the war issue that brought me to liberty. I got in through, kind of, I don't know, economics and this philosophy thing. But kind of getting into it, I mean, it really is the worst thing that the state does. And Kyle Anzalone, when I first got into the space, I talked with him a lot, our colleague at the Libertarian Institute and antiwar.com. But he really made it clear to me, and listening to his show is just literally the worst thing. People dying for no reason. It's pure economic waste. And it's the worst thing ever. So I think it's important for us to kind of put it very high in our hierarchy of the things we're most opposed to and working against.
I completely agree. Couldn't have said it better.
So how did we go, just to kind of broach the issue, how did we go from, it seems like in your article you talk about the United States being skeptical of the robber barons during the Progressive Era and having this kind of natural, healthy skepticism. I know, like, when we're talking about it, it's always like, oh, back in the Stone Ages, America was isolationist and they didn't want to get involved abroad. But then you see this transformation. So how did the United States view war kind of during the Progressive Era?
Well, during the Progressive Era, you just have a uniform skepticism among the public towards big business, to what they referred to as the trusts, what they viewed as monopolists. And it's another excellent libertarian topic to discuss how these trusts were actually, in most part, artificially created through government intervention and through government protection, with each administration protecting their favored businessman and giving favors and all of that sort of thing. But in that era, you see a general distrust of businessmen, their motivations, and not seeing that their private motivations aligned with the public interest. And that's something that's getting discussed a bit more today in conservative circles. But from that, you have a great enmity felt in the public circle towards people like J.P. Morgan. In this case, J.P. Morgan Jr., his father, who had founded the company, the largest bank and the investment firm on Wall Street. He had just passed, I believe, in 1912, just a couple of years before World War I. And his son took over. And being the most powerful banker on Wall Street and having their investment firm and their hands and fingers in so many different pots and in so many different businesses, you could see Morgan interests in almost all parts of the U.S. economy. And a good portion of the public noticed this and were not happy about it, that to see these private figures having so much control over their lives, even if they didn't fully understand how much of it was the responsibility of capitalism versus state intervention.
And specifically, did you find that J.P. Morgan was the most influential of, I guess, what we call the robber barons, or did you find that like the Rockefellers were involved, or, it seems like you're saying J.P. Morgan was the biggest bank on Wall Street, but what was it about J.P. Morgan and the DuPonts that really brought them head and shoulders above the other robber barons?
I think it's certainly because of the era. By 1914, you already have the breakup of Standard Oil. Standard Oil's both financial and political power really peaked, and I believe it was about 1901. So by 1914, they're already on the decline, whereas the Morgans are still empowering themselves. And there are other investment banks like Kuhn Loeb and Company, which, because of their name and ancestry, are actually more German sympathetic, or at least that's how they're certainly portrayed as such, whereas the Morgans were very close to London banking interests. And for people who really want to delve into the topic, I can't recommend enough Wall Street Banks and American Foreign Policy by Murray Rothbard. It's personally probably my favorite essay of his. And I know it's one that's not talked about enough, where he essentially goes from the 1870s up until the 1970s, talking about different administrations and their financial connections, which investment banks were predominantly influential in their cabinets, who they were appointing, what the backgrounds were. President Roosevelt appointed this person to the cabinet, and their brother-in-law worked for this investment bank, and his wife was actually the daughter of this person, and getting those connections in. So I really recommend that to listeners if they want to delve further into the topic.
Yeah, that's great. And I'll have to make sure that I put that in the show notes page for everyone to take a look at. But I'm sure one thing that you didn't get a chance to talk about too much was like the role that J.P. Morgan had in creating the Federal Reserve itself. Did you? So I guess my first question is, did you rely a lot on that Rothbard article in framing the first part of this piece?
It definitely helped a lot. Yes, it was one of my sources.
Okay. And what about the founding of the Federal Reserve? Because I know we talk about, and Ron Paul has talked a lot about how the Federal Reserve and central banking helps fund war itself. Did you have in mind that the American conservative might not like that as much, or?
No, I think at the end of the day, the article I submitted was almost 7,000 words, and I did have to have a cutoff point. There was a lot more I would have liked to included, but at the end of the day, you got to write an article and not a book, and you got to decide what makes the cut and what doesn't.
Yeah. Sorry to put you on the spot there a little bit. Sorry about that, but
no, I'm happy to answer any questions.
So we go into
throw me some hardballs.
Yeah, right. Well, we go into J.P. Morgan and stuff like that. So let's see here. So I wanted to ask you too, then, how does Woodrow Wilson play into this? Because I know that the Prof. CJ from the Dangerous History podcast, and I think Dave Smith has said too, like almost everything terrible in the United States starts with Woodrow Wilson. And there was a connection that you made with him and J.P. Morgan. So do you want to tell us about that a little bit?
Yes. Woodrow Wilson was very much, from the beginning of his public career, he began as a professor at Princeton University, then the president of Princeton, governor of New Jersey, and finally elected president in 1912. And really for the entirety of his public career, he is in the Morgan ambit. He is sympathetic to Morgan interests. And I have a citation here in the article, which I'll just read the excerpt from. President Wilson had been in the Morgan ambit for years, even serving on the board of its subsidiary, the Mutual Life Insurance Company. It was alleged at the time and for years after that the House of Morgan pressured the administration to intervene on the side of the Allies to protect its financial investments. And you can see this by the people that Wilson appoints in his cabinet, people like Colonel House, Edward House, who was his personal advisor and informal advisor, very close with the Morgan family. And you can see not only with its financial interests, but even beyond that, that Wilson shared Morgan's similar sympathies. In 1914, when World War I starts and you have war erupt in Europe between the Central Powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary, and Britain, France, and Russia, Wilson shares the sentiment of a good chunk of the American public that Britain is correct in the war and is naturally sympathetic to British interests over German. And you can say that there was a certain Anglophilia among American elites at the time, simply because London was at that point still the center of financial resources in the world, global influence. It's not until after World War I that it really transfers from Britain to the United States as the leading world power. And having a shared language, shared history, those sympathies are very clear. So you have, when war breaks out, an administration that is both very close to financial interests who are close to foreign governments, and an administration who itself is sympathetic to those foreign governments. And I discuss in the article how at the beginning of the war, we have a proclaimed neutrality between Britain and Germany. But this is never actually the case. From the very beginning, the United States government in the Wilson administration displays its sympathy for Britain by having a double standard. We proclaim freedom of the seas, that the United States can send our ships anywhere we please without molestation, and we get very angry when German submarines and German ships attempt to interfere with that. However, the Wilson administration is completely mute when the British Navy, the Royal Navy, stops American ships, searches them, interferes with our trade, or the fact that the British government is blockading Germany from the sea and preventing all shipping, including American ships, from reaching Germany. There's no freedom of the seas here. It's just the fact, and you have interference on American shipping by both the British and German government. It's just the fact that we're only complaining about when one side does it. And that's something that's noticed very early on by William Jennings Bryan, who had been appointed Secretary of State in the Wilson administration. And Bryan, after the spring of 1915, notices this double standard and doesn't feel he can serve any longer in the administration. And it's the only time we've ever had a Secretary of State resign on principle in the entirety of American history. Because William Jennings Bryan, the great orator from Nebraska, who you and I would agree on some things on and have very strong disagreements on other issues. But the fact is that Bryan, in his heart, was always an anti-imperialist. And he wanted a true neutral policy by the American government in World War I. And when Wilson wasn't providing that, he resigned. One of the big issues he resigned on is the fact that after war breaks out in beginning of August 1914, Bryan, as Secretary of State, issues an order saying that there will be no financial loans from the Americans to either side. We are not going to financially connect ourselves to either of the belligerents, because that would simply break our neutrality. It would make us financially invested and then morally invested in one side winning over the other. And that's not what neutrality means. And in early 1915, you have the revocation of that order. And that is due to fierce lobbying by J.P. Morgan and Company, who are then appointed by the British and French government as their official stand-in in the United States. J.P. Morgan is officiated by the Crown and the French Republic, that you will advise our politicians, you will work for our government, and you will help us get loans to fight the war. And J.P. Morgan acts this way for the rest of the time the United States is allegedly at peace, from late summer of 1914 until we officially declare war on 1917. The American people may have been neutral, but J.P. Morgan was already fighting the war on behalf of the Allies and wanting the United States government and the United States military to invade on the side of Britain. And they had no qualms about making their influence and their position felt in the halls of power.
And so that headstrongness that you were talking about, of the United States shipping to go anywhere it pleases in the world, I think that's still kind of the case today, in a major way. And it's getting us in big trouble right now. But it did get us in big trouble in 1917. I guess trouble depends on your perspective, because do you think it'd be fair to say, and maybe this is speculation, well, I think you just said it's fair to say that J.P. Morgan wanted us involved in the conflict. And
Yes, I don't think there was any fair-minded historian of any political persuasion that would deny that it was in the Morgan interest for the United States to enter the war, and that the Morgan financial firm favored U.S. entry into the war and worked towards that effort.
do you know of any connection between like the Lusitania event and J.P. Morgan?
Not specifically, and I think it's what tripped up something we'll, I'm sure, be talking about later in this conversation. What tripped up some critics in the 1930s of the Morgan financial interests and how they attempted to portray how much influence they had. World War I is an incredibly complex topic that was fought over real reasons in Europe and real events, and I don't think you can place singular blame on either the Morgan banking interests or what we would today label a military-industrial complex for U.S. entry. There was deep British sympathy among the American public broadly. If you ask the average American, they would say, well, I don't think we should get involved in the war, but if I had to flip a coin, I'd prefer if Britain won. That was the public sympathy at the time. And there were certainly multiple policy disagreements and problems between the German government and the U.S. government that led eventually to the declaration of war. And those are separate issues to debate over. But so I don't think you can say it's a singular cause, but it's undeniable that it was one of the most significant causes of U.S. entry, the fact that we were financially tied by 1917 to British power, and that it was in now United States interests for Britain to win the war. And when I say United States interests, I'm specifically saying United States government interest, not the interest of the American people.
Right. So moving into the war a bit more, I know in your article you kind of discussed the effect that the war had on J.P. Morgan and DuPont interests. And I know we'll talk about the commission in just a second, but from just kind of an objective point of view, how did they benefit from the war, J.P. Morgan and DuPont specifically?
So the DuPont company, which was even older than J.P. Morgan, it goes back, I believe, to 1802 that it was originally founded, at the time a munitions maker. It was responsible for making gunpowder and other materials such as that. And I believe by the end of the war that the DuPont company had supplied a huge percentage of the gunpowder used by the Allies. And I break down the exact numbers in the article. And Morgan, of course, with U.S. entry, sending hundreds of thousands, millions of doughboys overseas into France to fight Germany, was able to secure victory for Britain and France and guarantee a financial return on the loans they had given those governments. It was said at the time that J.P. Morgan Jr. earned more money in those 2 years, 1917 and 1918, than his father did in his entire life. This, you have, their shares going up from the DuPont company. Their shares at 1914, at the beginning of the war, was $20 a share. By the end of the war, $1,000 a share. You have these people, these private firms, making enormous profits off of U.S. entry, and the fact that the United States needs to now buy weapons, continue to sell weapons to Britain and France, and you have these firms and the leaders of these firms, the CEOs, the presidents, making bank on the back of American war making, and specifically on the backs of the death of U.S. soldiers. And this is quite the outrage even at the time. You have senators like Robert La Follette, like George Norris, like Hiram Johnson, who has an episode that I discuss in the article, where Johnson, who actually voted for the war, says, if we're entering the war, which I initially supported, then at the very least it should be paid for by the people who are profiting off of it. And Hiram Johnson proposed an 80% tax on war profits by these companies. And when it failed by a solid majority in the Senate, he called all of his colleagues dollar patriots. They don't want to. All of these companies coin the blood of war, but they don't want to be taxed for it. It's outrageous. It's unpatriotic. It's un-American. And that was a sentiment that during the war was a minority. But you'll find after the war's conclusion throughout the 1920s and 30s, what was originally a minority view and a minority criticism of these firms becomes widely held by the public and by a significant percentage of people in politics.
And so then we have in the interwar years, the namesake of your article, this book, The Merchants of Death, comes out. So can you tell us about that a little bit?
Certainly. Like I said, after the war, you could say the landscape was very primed for this to happen, because at the end of the war, the United States, the American people, they look around and they see, well, we just went to war in Europe. What did we gain from this? We gained a lot of war debt that's not at the moment being repaid by Britain and France, which we were supposed to save. We have 117,000 dead doughboys, which was the term for U.S. soldiers during the war. And we have the Spanish flu. What exactly did we gain from this intervention? And you have this enormous recoiling after the war. Just for instance, behind me, I have a poster from the 1920 election right here between Harding and James Cox. Harding, the Republican, who runs as a rejection of the Wilson administration, wins in an earthquake landslide with 60% of the vote, such as the enormous revulsion against American intervention and American embrace of this sort of internationalism on behalf of the British Empire. And we have to use indications like that because the earliest kind of public polling on any issue dates back to the 1930s. So around this period, we can only go by these sort of indications of elections, telegrams to Congress, these more informal measures. But by the 1930s, it's very well accepted that amongst, again, a majority of the American public, and this is proved by later polls during the 1930s, that the average American looks back at World War I, the decade prior, and says, I don't think we went to war to save democracy, in the words of Woodrow Wilson. I think we went to war to protect shareholders. And that from there, you get in 1934 the publication of Merchants of Death, which is a book written, and I apologize if I butcher these names, by Helmuth C. Engelbrecht and Frank C. Hannigan. And Hannigan later becomes the co-founder of the conservative weekly Human Events, which is still publishing. Unfortunately, it's quite hawkish these days, hasn't followed in its lineage like we would have hoped. But these men write Merchants of Death, which is, I would say, a very fair scholarly book that essentially looks at half a dozen munitions companies, gives biographical information of them, their histories, and then goes down and breaks down the numbers of these are what these companies made in profits during the war. This is some of their activities during the war. And I think the average person who sits down to look at the material would find it a very fair analysis, because Merchants of Death is often derided as just ideological book that uses bad data and bad numbers and all these things. And I think that's partially based on the political bias of most people who study this history, who are very sympathetic to American intervention overseas and Woodrow Wilson and don't see a problem with the current system we live under. And it's very inflammatory title, which you started this conversation by saying, like, these are powerful words, and this is a powerful thing to call that these companies, merchants of death, that they are profiting and personally getting money off the death and destruction of American soldiers. It is, quite a thing to say. And I think that title can sometimes be derided Although I think it's, to be honest, fair coming from my position, and I think the data in the book backs that up. And I was quite happy to see that the American Conservative decided to use the title of that book for the title of the article, because I think it's as true now as it was true then. In fact, even more so. And the latter half of my piece is really discussing why we need to bring back terms like the merchants of death and bring back the public outrage that we had during that period, because it is so much more applicable today when these private firms, what we today label the military industrial complex, these weapons contractors, have much more influence and are making much more money than they ever were 80 years ago when the term was first used.
Hey everyone, and welcome to the portion of the show where I tell you how you can help support this content. Your one-stop shop is libertyweekly.net/support. And once you're there, you can see all the different ways to support my content. There is a Amazon wishlist there you can check out. There's also a PayPal button, paypal.me/libertyweekly for one-time donations. There's also a Patreon button and a Subscribe button where you can donate on a monthly basis in exchange for the bonus content that I do offer. So go check those out. There's an archive there with actually hundreds of posts going back years, and you get all access to all those things with your donation. There's also cryptocurrency addresses there with all the addresses for the cryptocurrencies that I accept. If you don't see one there you'd like to donate, just get in touch with me. And if you want access to bonus content but you don't want to pay a monthly fee, you can go over to Odyssey, libertyweekly.net/Odyssey, ODYSEE, and you can purchase my bonus content there a la carte, and you can purchase it for LBC, which is the cryptocurrency that the website runs on. The best deal for subscribing and getting my premium content, though, is to go to rockfin.com, ROKFIN. You can, for $10 a month, get access to tons of your favorite creators. And you also get access to my premium content there as well. And there's a lot of great creators there that you can check out on the screen here. But for you listening in the audio version, Last American Vagabond, Monica Perez and Brad Binkley from the Propaganda Report, Joanne Leone from Around the Empire, Kyle Anzalone as well from the Libertarian Institute. Just a whole bunch of people. Whitney Webb from Unlimited Hangout. So go check that out. One monthly subscription gets you access to all of that. And if you like my writing, I do sometimes release blog posts that don't end up on the Libertarian Institute on my Substack/Substack. So you can go check that out as well and see some of my writings for my email list. And of course, the Liberty Weekly podcast appears on the Libertarian Institute at libertarianinstitute.org, alongside other fine podcasts: Scott Horton, Pete Quinones, Free Man Beyond the Wall, Conflicts of Interest with Kyle Anzalone, Don't Tread on Anyone with Keith Knight, my show, and also Year Zero with Tommy Salmons. So go check out those other fine podcasts and help support the Libertarian Institute, libertarianinstitute.org. Thanks, everybody, and back to the show. Yeah, I was going to ask you, I'm glad that you brought that up, because I was going to ask you about your use of the word even-tempered, because I didn't know if you were trying to rejuvenate its purpose, or I'm glad that you mentioned that, because if people nowadays looking back at it, they would think that it's inflammatory. But yeah, it really was a fair ledger, if you will. I mean, of the profits that went in and out. And so we kind of go from...
If I could interrupt for a second, I'll just tell listeners that just Google Merchants of Death 1934, go through a couple links. You can find the entire PDF online. You can read it yourself.
Yeah, and I would encourage everyone to do that. I'll have to put that in the show notes page as well. So we kind of have Smedley Butler coming forward, and I know that Smedley Butler is someone who he wrote War is a Racket. You wrote a piece about Smedley Butler on his 140th birthday for the Libertarian Institute, and I'll put that up here. Happy 140th birthday, Smedley Butler. And by people in our circles, he's highly cited because of his piece, War is a Racket, and he's also one of the most highly decorated Marines in U.S. history. And you want to talk a little bit about, he kind of came into the frame. He turned into a bit of a politician at the end, not really in a bad use of the word either, because I think he was principled. But you want to talk about Smedley Butler a little bit?
Sure. Smedley Butler was originally from Westchester, Pennsylvania. He joined the Marine Corps I want to say age 17. He lied about his age to get in. That was just at the start of the Spanish-American War in 1898, 1899. And he had a full military career after that. He served, I want to say he saw action. I have all these details in the article you just showed, which was published, I want to say at the end of July. He served in, I want to say, over 120 battles on 4 continents. He fought in Central America, South America, Europe in World War I, sent to China multiple times. And he became the first Marine who was awarded 2 Medals of Honor. He was a war hero in the literal sense. And after his retirement in 1931 from the U.S. Marine Corps, you have him start speaking out publicly about how he feels about his own military career and what he feels were the financial interests that were directing his military career. He says, and I include this quote in the article, he describes himself as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. And he explains in his short pamphlet book, if I remember correctly, it's only about 80 pages, War's a Racket, also available free online, where he discusses how these different companies like United Fruit use the U.S. government and lobby it to send people like the U.S. Marine Corps into these foreign countries like Panama, Nicaragua, Honduras, to lay down the law and say, local governments, if you want to interfere with the U.S. financial system, we're going to have a problem with that. And Butler was sent in to quell these sort of rebellions against early U.S. hegemony. And he recognizes that fact, writes about it. And yes, after he leaves the Corps, he does have a short political career, which I loved discussing in my article, because a lot of people have written articles on Smedley Butler, and I highly recommend Danny Surgeon's article on Smedley Butler, which he wrote just a couple of years ago, as certainly better than mine, and Danny's the real expert. But the thing I wanted to do with my article was have it a bit more all-encompassing, because so many people focus only on Smedley's military career and then War's a Racket, but I wanted to take into account more of his political actions, like when he was essentially the chief of police of Philadelphia in the 1920s and what that meant. And in 1932, Smedley Butler ran for the U.S. Senate as a Republican on a political platform. And I think it's breathtaking for people like us to imagine that, wow, I could have gone to the ballot and cast a vote to put Smedley Butler in the U.S. Senate. It's an incredible thing that I think is a detail not often talked about. And you see over the course of the 1930s, Smedley Butler dies far too young in 1940. Over the last decade of his life in the private sphere, he becomes more radical, certainly to say more progressive. He is not opposed to speaking to all manners of groups, including far left groups, even some communist organizations. But also, conservative Rotary clubs, really any organization he can get in front of to preach his message of the U.S. war machine is unnecessary. So many of our interventions are only to the benefit of private business and not the American people, and that we need to do something about it, and that we need to the American people need to retake control of their government, and as long as it exists, make sure it serves their interests, not individual private actors, which he calls is essentially a racket. And he labels the entire industry of war a racket. And he includes in his book some of the same numbers and analysis that's used in Merchants of Death, describing the profits that were made by industry during World War I, whether that's selling rifles or just selling shoes to the service members. because when the U.S. military gets involved, it's a very profitable industry for a lot of people if they want to get involved in that. But it's not profitable for the soldiers themselves, and it's certainly not profitable to their families, many of which will never see them again.
So moving on a little bit here, can you tell us a little bit about Gerald Nye and the Nye Commission, and especially about how he came? It seems that he's chosen a bit to lead that commission. You want to tell us about that?
Sure. Gerald Nye was the first thing I got corrected on when I was interviewing people. It's Gerald, even though it's usually pronounced Gerald.
Oh, awesome.
Gerald Nye was a U.S. senator from North Dakota. He was originally a newspaper editor during World War One. Actually, when the war started, he was in favor of it. But similar to a lot of people of similar degrees, such as Hiram Johnson, William Borah, a lot of these people that I think we find ourselves very sympathetic with on foreign policy, who initially supported the war, but very quickly came to realize their folly. He was quite, we could say, progressive in the sense of he was a Robert La Follette Republican, and he even abandoned the Republican Party in 1924 to support Robert La Follette's campaign for president on the Progressive Party ticket. Nye saw himself opposed to monopoly capitalism. He saw himself opposed to big business, very favorable to farmers, and very much in favor of the government stepping in to take control of some of these industries, which he saw as stepping on the little people. And there's no more little people than North Dakota. But at the same time, he viewed himself as an America firster, extremely patriotic, extremely nationalistic, and very skeptical of international ties that would bound the United States or infringe on its sovereignty, or would obligate the United States to go to war when it was not in the American people's interest. He's initially appointed to an open Senate seat in 1925, and then is reelected to a full term in 1926. And Patrick, you know this about me. I'm actually a collector of a lot of political items. You can see by some of the posters behind me. People can see it well. I actually have a pin from Nye's 1926 Senate campaign. It's a picture of Gerald Nye, and it says, "He serves us well." And I think he did serve the people of North Dakota well, and he did serve their interests. He's reelected in 1932. And then come 1934, same year as the publication of Merchants of Death, which quickly became a top seller. It was a Book of the Month club. It was widely read and very influential on public opinion. You have a certain group of activists and sympathetic senators sitting down and saying, there is now a rich public atmosphere to do something about these weapons contractors and this big business which enriched itself during World War I. What are we going to do about it? And you have a meeting between Dorothy Detzer, who was a women's rights activist, anti-war activist, really an ideological pacifist, who's very involved in these issues in the interwar movement, and someone I would say, a very inspiring feminine figure, in my opinion. She sits down with George Norris, who was a progressive Republican from Nebraska, even more progressive than most. He had originally endorsed Woodrow Wilson in 1916 and would endorse FDR in 1932. And when we actually went to war in 1917, he quickly abandoned Wilson and was one of the few senators to vote against going to war in World War I, because in his words, we are about to put the dollar sign upon the American flag. So in 1934, Dorothy Detzer and George Norris sit down and they go through systematically a list of all 96 U.S. senators to decide who they want to put as the face of this new movement against the weapons manufacturers. George Norris saying that he was too old at the time to really do what was necessary. And they go through the entire list and they cross off every single name except Gerald Nye, who, due to his chairmanship and investigations looking into the Teapot Dome scandal in the 1920s and some reform work he had already done, had already been nicknamed Gerald the Giant Slayer. So it's a very appropriate choice. And he's reticent at first. He rejects the offer a few times, but eventually acquiesces, accepts, and says, okay, I will become the face of this movement, and I'm going to put my all into this. Gerald Nye was a very inflammatory speaker. He was not afraid to use tough language, and he was not afraid to be controversial. And that certainly developed a lot of headlines. In 1934, using some good politicking and back scratching in the U.S. Senate, which I described in the piece, and general public pressure, we find the creation of the Special Committee on Investigation of the Munitions Industry, which colloquially becomes termed the Nye Committee, because Nye is quickly elected its chairman. Keep in mind that the U.S. Senate at this time is 3/4 Democratic. This is the height of the Depression, height of FDR's political power. So you now have a Republican senator leading one of the most eye-catching and important committees going on in politics. And that really describes Nye's influence on this. And the Nye Committee now has investigatory power that only Congress has. Up until this point, there had been, and even since that point, from the committee's existence, 1934 to 1936, we have seen nothing like it that has investigated the munitions industry to the degree that Nye did. You have some perfunctory commissions before and after, but nothing with the power to actually say, hey, J.P. Morgan Jr., the DuPont brothers, we are calling you and demanding and requiring that you come before U.S. Congress, sit down publicly before the people, and answer these questions from these elected representatives about your dealings during World War I, what you did, how you profited, and we want to look over your books too and see what exactly were you doing behind the scenes. Nothing like this has ever happened before or since. It's something that would, I'm sure you would agree, almost impossible in today's politics to imagine that the CEO of Raytheon or Northrop Grumman would be demanded to come to Congress and sit down for a harsh grilling from oppositional senators. It defies logic, but this happened. And Nye was the head of it. And he said a lot of quotes that were certainly headline grabbing. I include some of them in the article. For instance, the time is coming when there will be a realization of what monkeys munition makers can make of the otherwise intelligent people of America, and other things like this. He was very popular with radio addresses and all of these things. And what the Nye Committee did was it investigated the behavior of these companies, and it discovered what most people assumed what they would find, and that included bribery of foreign officials. That included the selling of weapons to both sides of conflicts, primarily in South America. That included underhanded and covert undermining of disarmament conferences, which were popular during the 1920s and 30s, and generally a malign influence on U.S. politics. And saying that, hey, Smedley Butler is right, and Merchants of Death, the authors, are right. This is an international racket, and that these companies are benefiting themselves at the expense of the American people. And Nye's answer to this, I think the listeners will find this amusing. Nye's answer to this was a few things, such as instead of simply buying weapons privately, more of them should be made, more Navy ships should be made in government stockyards, things like this. But also, if we go to war, that anyone making over $10,000 in 1935 money, I don't know what that calculates today, but should automatically be come to a 98% tax, something outrageous. And Nye reveled in this proposition. He said, do that and then observe the number of jingoists diminish. And the Nation magazine, progressive then as it is now, said, if such effort at taxation, a sort of anti-war tax were ever created, then businessmen would become our leading pacifists. So you have a mixture of the committee doing good investigatory work, and they hold over 200 meetings during its 2-year existence, and call numerous people to testify, and actually have people like John T. Flynn, that great hero of the old right and old right journalist, as on their advisory council to help them do work. They do some excellent findings, but at the same time, they're making, these sort of propositions, which at the time was actually broadly popular among Americans, although not politically flexible and certainly not by today's standards. And there is something to be said, in being fair, that Nye was, as I said, was quite the talker. He was a hothead. He did overstep in some of his arguments, and like we discussed earlier, when I said putting blame singularly on the House of Morgan or investment firms for getting us into World War One, he was guilty of that to a certain degree, perhaps overstepping. But I am sympathetic to how George Norris described his behavior, where he excused all of this stuff as, quote, the rashness of enthusiasm. And that's how I prefer to see Gerald Nye. Do you want me to go into the end of the committee and how that went down? Or do you want to keep going?
Yeah. Well, one thing I was just going to say is that, first off, it's really too bad that our discourse has kind of devolved to the point where the American public, if they heard Gerald Nye speak, probably wouldn't understand half the words that he says, which I think is really sad. And this is really just hard to imagine this happening. Of course, it would never happen in the current day, and if it did, I think it would be a show trial, something like that, for politicians to kind of put on this persona, kind of like the Senate or the Judiciary Committee confirmation hearings of Amy Coney Barrett or something like that. But the only parallel I could think of was the Iran-Contra Commission and Oliver North. But at the same time, I just kind of felt like, and I don't know it well enough to really speak with authority, but I kind of felt like maybe that was a show trial issue, kind of like a limited hangout kind of thing. But did you get the sense at all that this was like a put on for show, and that we'll get to the end of it, I guess. You can, why don't you tell us how it ends? And then I'll ask you that same question.
Sure. So it ends, the committee comes to an end in early 1936 when Gerald Nye steps beyond the bounds of respectable politics. He goes a step too far in the minds of people in Washington. And what does he do that is so outrageous? He criticizes Woodrow Wilson. How dare he? Woodrow Wilson at this point has been dead 12 years. And Nye comes out and he says that he believes Woodrow Wilson lied to Congress when we declared war in 1917. And it became public knowledge after we had declared war and confirmed at the Treaty of Versailles in 1919 that there had been secret negotiations and secret treaties among the Allied powers like Britain, France, and Italy over what a post-war world would look like, and essentially divvying up the spoils of war before it had already been won. Because one of the things that Woodrow Wilson did to really gain public opinion in favor of going to war and getting people, even like Robert La Follette, who voted against going to war, getting someone like La Follette sympathetic to his position, was saying, this will be a war without victors. At the end of the war, we are going to truly make the world safe for democracy. We will have national sovereignty. We will have freedom for peoples. We will not have a bad peace with Germany. And we will not try to create a spirit of revenge. Now, of course, the exact opposite happened at Versailles, and it's one of the things that really crumbled Woodrow Wilson's image in the public opinion. And Nye accused Wilson of being aware of this beforehand, saying that when he went in April 1917 and asked Congress to declare war, he was already aware of these secret treaties. He and his Secretary of the State at the time, William Jennings Bryan's successor, Robert Lansing, who was an uncle to the Dulles brothers, the 1950s, that they were aware of these secret treaties. They were aware that there was not going to be any self-determination. There was not going to be this just peace. This war without victory. And he accused Wilson of lying. And that really turned over the apple cart because, as I mentioned previously, you have a Senate that is overwhelmingly dominated by Democrats, and specifically, as the New York Times referenced them, old-line Democrats, the lovers of Woodrow Wilson. These are men who, early in FDR's term, are still backing in the glory of Woodrow Wilson is the quintessential Democratic president, the president of the 21st century, and are fully defenders of his legacy, including U.S. entry into the war and the League of Nations and all of this stuff. So when Nye, again, this North Dakota Republican, comes forward and says, hey, the person that your party, that the spiritual leader of your party, I'm accusing him of lying and deceiving us into war from beyond the grave. And this creates a huge stirring of outrage among Democratic senators, including from Carter Glass of Virginia, who, if I remember correctly, was one of the primary sponsors of the Federal Reserve Act in 1913. Carter Glass, at this point in 1936, 78-year-old senator, still knocks his knuckles against his desk in the U.S. Senate until they bleed to call Gerald Nye a coward for attacking Woodrow Wilson, dead these 12 years. How dare you? And this really creates the public, not really the public still overwhelmingly supports Gerald Nye's position, but this position in Washington where Nye's position is no longer tenable. The Roosevelt administration had given itself over to endorsing the committee when it first began in 1934, primarily for political reasons. There's debate among historians on whether some historians claim that FDR also viewed the munitions makers as merchants of death. There are others who claim that this was purely a political move. He disagreed with Nye entirely, and he always hated what they labeled the isolationists. But I'm more sympathetic to the view that FDR was looking for Midwest support for his economic programs. This is, again, during the first phase of the New Deal. FDR is not paying any attention to foreign policy at this point, not until starting in 1937, 1938. So you have the administration having an excuse to pull the rug out from under Nye and deny them continued funding. And the committee ends quite abruptly in early 1936. It's existed for 2 years, again held over 200 committee meetings, discovered a lot of good information, proved some of its points, not others. Even Nye, at the end of the committee, admits, and I'll actually read from his official conclusion, quote, "It would not be fair to say that the House of Morgan took us to war to save their investment in the Allies," concluded Nye. "But the record of facts makes it altogether fair to say that these bankers were in the heart and center of a system that made our going to war inevitable." And Nye put specific emphasis on Wilson's lifting of the ban of supplying credit, the one that had been instituted by William Jennings Bryan. And Nye claims that it paved and greased the road to war, that by putting our financial investment on the side of Britain and France, we made our military involvement inevitable, and that the House of Morgan has culpability for that. So does the Nye Committee definitively prove the Merchants of Death thesis? Not entirely, but even the book itself admits that it was not that the munitions makers were not the singular cause of U.S. entry into World War I. So it's a much more complicated issue than I think a lot of commentators try to give it credit for. They try to say that, Nye and his political allies put complete responsibility on Morgan and DuPont and the makers of these weapons and the quote-unquote merchants of death, when in reality they did view it as a more nuanced topic, and they should be credited as such.
So to go back to my initial question, or my earlier question, you don't get the sense that this was kind of a show trial thing, or the sense that it went on as long as the Democratic senators deemed it to go on.
No, I do not think you could call this a show trial whatsoever. The fact is that most of the Senate was happy to ignore the committee, most of the Democratic senators and Republicans along with them. The Nye committee, and they had to not support it, but be happy to ignore it because, again, Nye was getting huge headlines, huge press. That there was the Nye committee and these hearings were some of the biggest stories going on in America, and they were well reported in the media. And the fact is that on the committee, if I remember correctly, it was 7 people sitting. Some of them were Democratic stand-ins, simply members who didn't really care, but they were there. A lot of them, to be honest, missed some of the committee meetings, but you really have it being led by true believers like Gerald Nye and Homer T. Bone, Democratic senator from Washington State, who is another true believer. And when these heads of companies, when the head of Bethlehem Steel comes and sits before the committee, Homer T. Bone is asking him real questions, and he's demanding answers and putting him on the spot and getting those. And there was legitimate information that was gotten from it because Congress went and got the records from these companies, their private bookkeeping, because they wanted to see if there was any sort of a collaboration going on with naval bidding. And it turns out there wasn't at the time. But you don't see, pretty much everything we know about the munitions industry, that the resources that historians use to look at the period from World War I up until the 1930s is almost wholly based on the paperwork that Nye subpoenaed and was able to get. So I think there were real results from this in that sense. They were looking for answers and they got some. There just wasn't the complete effect that they originally wanted. And that's because they went up against the system. And at the time, the system was still more powerful. And that's despite public opinion being on the side of Nye. And I go through the public opinion polls in the article where from 1937 up until 1940, people were asking the American people, why do you think we went into World War I? Do you think it was the right decision for us to make? And what do you think should be done about these companies making a private profit? And you have majorities of the public saying that, or certainly you have majorities of the public saying that, no, I don't think private industry should be making our weapons. The government should be doing it instead, so there isn't a profit motive. And you have a strong plurality, if not a majority, certainly a much stronger number than the opposite side, saying, I believe we were tricked into World War I. This was a mistake. We were given false information. Even as far as late 1939, after the German invasion of Poland, the beginning of the Second World War, you still have the American people saying, this was a bad idea. Show me what we got from this war. And the truth is, there was nothing there. And most of the public realized it. Most Democrats did, and overwhelmingly Republicans did. And I find that so inspiring. I find the 1930s to be an inspiring period in the sense of, I know that's quite a strange statement for most people. It's the era of the rise of fascism in Europe and the New Deal in America and economic centralization and all of these things. But the fact is, during the interwar period, you had a majority of Americans embracing a kind of anti-imperialist, middle-class conservatism where they said, we want to put America first, and we don't believe our country, the United States, is responsible for interfering overseas or dictating to other countries how they run their affairs. And I think that's a good thing. I think it's important for people, like-minded people like us, to really kind of embrace that legacy of the old right and people like Gerald Nye and hold him up as an exemplar of the public good and saying, here is one man who stood up against what we today call the military-industrial complex and called them out for what they were. Because there's very few heroes like that in American history. And when we find real men, and I think it's something excellent that Dave Smith said recently, where he said, our ideas are great and we can love our ideas, but the fact is, it's real flesh and blood people, men and women, who get the ideas done, advocate them, and lead on them. And I think it's so important to look in American history and find figures like Gerald Nye, Robert La Follette, Hiram Johnson, William Borah, these great men who stood up for their country, stood up for America first, and against overseas imperialism and against war profiteering. Because you and I come from a rich, deep intellectual legacy in this country, and we need to be damn proud of that. And that's one of the things I wanted to try to do with this article, focusing so much on Gerald Nye in the 1930s, because the latter half of the piece is talking about the modern military-industrial complex, running through some numbers, but I thought it was so crucial to include the historical context for that, because it's something more people need to know about, more people like us need to know about, because I find it just flat out inspiring. It's something where we do stand on the shoulders of giants, and we can look at Gerald Nye and what he said in 1934 and what he said about these companies and say, damn right, he was correct, and we're still correct, and we need to take a page out of his handbook.
Well, that was awesome. That was full of sound bites and everything, and I think that it was, and I think we should leave it there, because I'm feeling inspired, and I think that's a good end note to leave on. But most importantly, I want the listeners to go and read the rest of your article, because you touch on Dwight D. Eisenhower and kind of going through the war in Vietnam, and then to where we're at today, and going through all the big arms manufacturers, and maybe just as a little bit of an end note, do you want to kind of get to how do these weapon manufacturers today influence public opinion? I think we can end on that little bit, but encourage everyone to read your article.
Well, certainly the military-industrial complex term coined first used in the late 1940s, but I believe Eisenhower was the first public figure to really bring it forth. And now it's just become colloquial to describe the intersection of big business and the Pentagon and these weapon contractors. The military-industrial complex today holds enormous influence over our politics, and you can see that over the campaign donations that they make to various political campaigns, both Republican and Democrat, and what they're able to get away with in D.C., where they're given multi-billion-dollar contracts, and they return products that don't work, late, are overcharged, and nobody really seems to care in Washington, D.C., because it's mostly a jobs program. And I mentioned this in the article. It's mostly a jobs program so that people in Northern Virginia can make good money while working 20-hour weeks. And they don't really see a problem with that. And the connection that I try to make as one of the primary theses of the article is that what Gerald Nye and his colleagues and the people using the Merchants of Death narrative in the 1930s, what they described didn't fully exist during that time. The fact is that business, even companies like DuPont, war contracts made up a very small percentage of their business. They were not primarily driven off of government largesse. It's the complete opposite today. The top 5 companies describe the top 5 weapons manufacturers and contractors with the Pentagon. Over 60%, sometimes over 90% of their money, their profits, come from these government contracts, because post-World War II, we've become a nation at permanent war and perpetual fighting. We are a war economy, and that's what has really driven this. And I mentioned at the end of the article a quote that was used in 1971 to ask the question, does the American economy have a military-industrial complex? Or is the American economy a military-industrial complex? Is it all-encompassing? And I think it's something that we can look towards Gerald Nye and the example he set and take inspiration from that to fight against it in the modern day, and these companies who are enriching themselves in this way. And I suppose I should put the joinder at the end of this to say, I'm as libertarian as you or anyone else at the Institute. I think the marketplace is a great thing. I support private industry. I am not in favor of economic regulation. But I think it's important for libertarians to look very coldly at these things and say that things like Lockheed Martin, which receives over 90% of its existence from taxpayer money in these military contracts, it's another arm of the government. It should not be treated as a private business. And we should feel a natural disgust and outright contempt for these people to say that these allegedly private companies are profiting off our tax money and then making profits off of the government sending our men and women in uniform off to the Middle East to die in these endless wars, I don't think that's justly acquired profit. And I think libertarians need to be able to say and delineate a line between what is truly the marketplace and private industry and something that, say, gives us consumer goods versus these weapon contractors who I don't think deserve any protection under a libertarian standard.
Yeah, I completely agree, and that's well said. And just examining all that and kind of reflecting on it, it's a lot to take in. I mean, especially with this history. But the thing that you said the best that is very inspiring is this always gets me, is to think at the legacy of these ideas and the people who have come before us who have been battling against this and warning it against it. And it's sad to see that, their warnings were true and that things really have devolved from there. But I like Ron Paul is a happy warrior. I tried to wake up, and I've told this story before, but my grandfather was a John Bircher, and I still have a newspaper clipping that he wrote against the first Gulf War. And he was saying how, conservatives won't be tricked again because we supported the war in Vietnam, but we won't be tricked again. And there's all these interests at play that people don't understand. So we won't be fooled by it. And I try to remember that, when we do these interviews and when I write pieces and stuff like that. But to remember that lineage that we are a part of is just so inspiring. And I think that as it stands here, it feels like we're really just standing at the precipice of a huge disaster. And it's most important now to be the voice of resistance and to say, like Scott says, it didn't have to be this way. And we have an alternative. So, well, any last things that you'd like to plug here, Hunter? And I'm so glad that you could join me tonight.
I was very happy to be here, Patrick. I really enjoyed this conversation. Only plugs. I would encourage people to read the article. You and I discussed basically the first half and some of the historical stuff, but I think people would find some very interesting and usable numbers and analysis about the modern military-industrial complex. So I encourage them to go read that. I encourage listeners to go follow me on Twitter at Hunter DeRensis, just my name. I think I think you have a pretty good Twitter feed. It's worth following. And yeah, I have a very not well to put together website, hunterderensis.com, where I just literally post links to my articles if anyone wants to follow that stuff. And I think that's about it. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and thank you for helping give me a platform to talk about these ideas and promote this content, which, I care about so deeply.
Yeah, well, it's wonderfully written, and thank you for writing it. And I would encourage all the listeners to go and read it, because there's so many things here that I learned myself, and I consider myself to be someone who's fairly well educated on these subjects. So everyone
I would consider you to be that too.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, man. So, well, we're going to continue to work really hard at the Libertarian Institute to bring you great content, and we're just really excited about the future of the project. So again, go over to libertarianinstitute.org/donate and see the things that you can get in return. So, well, once again, Hunter, thanks again, and we'll do this again.
Looking forward to it, Patrick.